mentioned, it's very important to keep the dialogue between policy and the environmental research and the outcome and new developments going to feed in, to review the policies and to move forward. And it would be very good that we could have actually both groups sitting together, but unfortunately it wasn't feasible for just a one-day conference. But we have an opportunity at the end of the day to mix this group, these researchers and the policymakers, so I'm looking forward to the discussions at the end. A brief introduction of myself. I'm Harry Armens and I'm working at the Center for Ecology and Hydrology in Bangor here. I'm very interested in the interface between science and policy. I'm chair of an international cooperative program reporting on the impacts of air pollution on vegetation, and that reports to the policy side of the Long-Range Transboundary Air Pollution Convention. So, and it's one of the where science and policy are very closely linked traditionally already since 1979. So without any further delay, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Kurt Jax from the Helmholtz Center for Environmental Research in Leipzig in Germany. He's involved in various European projects and has been involved in ecosystem service research in recent years. And one of the projects is, for example, peer research on ecosystem services called PRESS. He's also involved in Be Safe, Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, Arguments for Our Future Environment. And he will also present something, I think, in his presentation on a project called Openness, where CH is also involved in, and it's about operationalization of natural capital and ecosystem services from the concepts to real-world applications. And I think it's very important that we get out of our ivory tower for some of the scientists and go into the real world, like Jackie already mentioned this morning, have contact with people on the ground and discuss how we can help each other. So Jack, the floor is yours. Good, sorry.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation and thank you very much for your kind introduction, Harry. Following up on what Harry said, in fact, ecosystem services research has never been purely fundamental research, at least from its intention. From the beginning, it has been connected very much to application and also in a broader sense to policies. This is also visible in the two origin it has. The first was more or less in landscape planning and landscape management in continental Europe, but the more important or the more effective one, which brought the whole field into the public, was connected to conservation biology, and the first appearance in the literature was in Paul and Anne Ehrlich's book on extinction in 1981, where they used the argument to defend the importance of biodiversity, as we would say today. If we look at the development of the literature in the early times, it didn't have much effect, but today, in recent years, the number of papers has risen dramatically, and quite a good share of that is also with European authors. The real important steps were, in fact, by which the literature increased were in 1997, the publication of Gretchen Ehrlich's book Nature Services, and in the same year, the publication of the paper of Bob Costanza on the words of the ecosystem, the value of the words ecosystems. And the second rise, even more important one, which also brought the whole concept into policy arena, was the publication of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. So research is, of course, not restricted to Europe, it's international, but the European side has some, especially also European institutions, have had some very important influences on environmental research on ecosystem services, be it by funding in the framework programs, especially Framework Program 7, but also the EEA or the recent biodiversity strategies, which led to a lot of research in this direction. So the general idea of ecosystem services is displayed in various schemes. I tried to use a very simplified one here, and it is simply that, that some components from ecosystems which humans desire or require lead to benefits, and these in turn lead to human well-being. And so from this scheme, you already see there's a close connection between different sciences necessary to tackle this complex issue of ecosystem services. If you look at the specific definition, sometimes the box desired ecosystem components and processes has been called ecosystem services in a narrow sense, or sometimes the benefits box that depends on the different definitions that are around in this field. So in principle, this looks at an ideal field for a variety of research activities, and I want just to sketch a very few ones which are major research fields on ecosystem services in the current time. A lot of work is done still on methodologies and classifications, and from the European side, I just wanted to mention CISIS, the Common International Classification on Ecosystem Services, hosted by the EEA and moderated by Roy Haynes-Young, who will speak later, and also two large-scale European research project called Openness and Operas, to which I will say a little bit more in the later part of my talk. Secondly, much work is done on the biophysical foundations of ecosystem services, and an example here would be the STEP project, which is focusing on pollination services and its influences on ecosystem services and its relation to environmental changes. Of course, then assessment and monitoring plays an important role, and the paradigmatic one study is here the Millennium ecosystem assessment, and in the UK, and the most elaborate national ecosystem assessment is really the UK national ecosystem assessment, but there are also others around in other countries meanwhile. Mapping in this context plays a specific important role, and there's a group now, the so-called MAS group, Mapping of Ecosystem Services, which the European Commission initiated and which tries to help the different member states to map their ecosystem services as demanded by the new EU biodiversity strategies. And the PRESS project, which Harry already mentioned, helped in the earlier times to develop and scrutinize some of these methods already. Economic valuation and accounting, of course, is another very important research field, and we heard already about the TEEP studies, and there is a lot of more regional or national follow-up studies on the evaluation of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Beyond these major fields, there are some other important ones which are not major fields, but which we should care about in relation to the subject of this conference. This is, for example, mainstreaming of ecosystem services into other policy sectors than just conservation, and projects Openness and Operas are aiming at this, but also the development of science policy interfaces for biodiversity and ecosystem services, and one important project here is CNU, or Biodiversity Knowledge, as it's also called, another important EU project which is just about to finish next year. So, given that we would expect that we have a lot of very interdisciplinary research, but if we look deeper into the literature, we will become rather disappointed. My colleague Kai Chan from British Columbia recently did a study in evaluating the literature in terms of what it really aims at, the literature on ecosystem services. And I can present some of his unpublished results with his courtesy. If you look at it, there's a couple of his analysis provided, there's a couple of studies, a large amount of studies that's dealing with biophysical aspects of ecosystem services, and there's quite a lot of studies, but even already less is dealing with the valuation aspects. But there's only a very small amount of studies that's doing valuation and biophysical analysis really together. And what you also see is that only about 20% of the studies that are keyworded ecosystem services are really dealing with these issues. So what's about the rest? And the rest is what you might have expected, perhaps, but not in that dimension, that almost 70% of the studies are only using ecosystem services as a catchword, but not really doing intense research on it, but just because it's popular, it drops out as a key, drops up as a keyword. And even less studies are done on the social dimensions of ecosystem services research. So this is quite a sobering result in terms of interdisciplinarity and in terms of making also this concept useful for practical applications. And I want to use this as a starting point for sketching a few challenges which we face in ecosystem services research today. The first one I want to emphasize is, which comes out quite clearly of the preceding analysis, is that we still have to do some more work on linking the different dimensions of the ecosystem services concept, namely the ecological, economic, and social one, roughly, within research. Why is that important? Because ecosystem services are not just a matter of biophysical components dealing directly in a causal way to benefits and human well-being, but there are, in fact, individual and societal goals involved and a lot of choices, societal choices, which determine which is an ecosystem service at all. For example, if you look at biomass production, in many cases it's would be called an ecosystem service. But if this biomass production consists of algae in a lake, you wouldn't consider it an ecosystem service. But if these same algae can be used for bioenergy, they would again be an ecosystem service. So there's a lot of choices involved, what counts as an ecosystem service and what does not count. And in a way, we have to work our way from the right-hand side of this graph to the left-hand side by this means. This shows up also in some study. The breast study was already mentioned, and one of the results, what we did there, was also that we investigated in 3 different regions of Europe, in Poland, Finland, and Germany, people about the most important ecosystem services, and not quite unexpectedly they differed. But not only that, the second question then was if there were antagonisms or trade-offs or synergies between the different services, and turned out that even within the same region, people had quite different perception if there were synergies or trade-offs, which shows again that it's not just a simple way to evaluate the importance of ecosystem services and their trade-offs and synergy, but a lot of societal choices are really involved here, which we have to consider. In fact, ecosystem services is a field which is loaded with a lot of value decisions and questions relating to values, which we have to tackle and to answer, starting with the question, who bears the cost of the production of ecosystem services, for example, in third world countries that are used here, who benefits here, what constitutes well-being, who decides which parts of ecosystems are considered ecosystem services, and so on. This even leads to the question, or even leads to the postulate that using the ecosystem service concept and economic instruments is really selling out on nature instead of preserving it. So there's a contradiction constructed or a contradiction seen with biodiversity conservation, which we have to take very serious. So the second relation, the second postulate, the second challenge that comes up with this observation is that we have to clarify more than we did before, the relation between biodiversity and ecosystem services. And the concern that biodiversity may get lost by these economic or seemingly economic instruments is taken up, for example, also in the MAS discussion paper, Mapping of Ecosystem Service, in which biodiversity becomes a very prominent place again, while it's almost lost in many schemes on ecosystem services and their relation to society. And also there has been considerable research, for example, in a recent paper by Georgina Mace and et al. On at which places of the chain from ecosystem processes to goods and values biodiversity appears, or if biodiversity is an ecosystem services or is the basis of ecosystem services, and different answers have been in fact given. But this does not cover the whole realm of the question. In fact, most studies or most cover only the empirical perspective, how is biodiversity biophysical related to ecosystem services, or, which is also important, what is specifically meant by biodiversity and ecosystem services, both terms or both concepts being very broad ones with very different meanings from different people. But as important as this is the value perspective, which values are connected with efforts to protect biodiversity and which values are connected with those to protect ecosystem services, which in fact leads also to the question of a strategic perspective. Why is it important to relate biodiversity to ecosystem services at all, instead of keeping them separate? As I said in the beginning, originally ecosystem services was an argument to protect biodiversity, but now it may be that we are in the role of the sorcerer's apprentice and ecosystem services is running free and leaving somewhat biodiversity behind. And so much of the discussion is on behalf of the strategic perspective and on the value perspective, and we have to deal with all these four dimensions of perspective to really answer the question on the relation between biodiversity and ecosystem services. That leads me to one more point, or to the point that in fact we have to scrutinize much more the box of human well-being. In the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment, it was already dealt with in a much more complex manner than just GDP. But nevertheless, even in the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and most of the further studies, the idea of human well-being has not been elaborated much more. And we need to elaborate this much more to really work our way from the right to the left of this graph and really include societal choices and societal opinions also within a single society much more in detail to make the concept usable for practical applications and for policies. That leads me to my last challenge. It says that we have to tailor the ecosystem services concept for different purposes, and that we don't have that ecosystem services is not a one-fits-all solution, but that different purposes, different demands lead to quite different ways in which we have to communicate and conceptualize the concept. A project in which we are doing it, it was already mentioned, is the Openness Project, and there is a twin project, Operas. But as I'm in the Openness Project, I will focus on this. And it tries to operationalize natural capital and ecosystem services for different policy fields and look very strongly into the different needs of different users of this concept. And for this, these schemes from EU project, it focuses inter alia very much not just on general scientific questions, but on societal challenges like human well-being, sustainable management, good governance, and competitiveness, which should be a subject of all the theoretical work packages, but also be included in the place-based exploration of ecosystems and ecosystem service and natural capital concept. That is, we have 26 case studies in Europe and in other parts of the world which are dealing with quite different policy fields like management of forests or integrated river basin management. And we will meet next week in Scotland with all these case studies to discuss the mutual research needs and management needs. So here the task is to strengthen inter- and transdisciplinarity, the lettering meaning the involvement of stakeholders. So we want to bring stakeholders in at all stages of research. We want to learn from place-based application and respond to different user needs, and we emphasize the importance of societal choices. We do not aim to say this is the only way to operationalize ecosystem services. but we aim at multiple solutions, or what we call a menu of solutions within this project. So this project is very ambitious, and we are just almost 1 year now into the project. So we will see if we will really reach all these ambitious goals, because especially in such a large project, it's still very difficult to really do interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary work. So some conclusions. There are large amounts of good data available with many ongoing projects and growing databases, but interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary still has to be improved. For this, we also have to strengthen the social dimensions of the ecosystem services concept and research on these dimensions. And we have to develop the ecosystem services approach further for different needs and different users. And finally, I want to emphasize, we don't have only to scrutinize the potentials of this concept, but it's equally important to scrutinize the limitations of the concepts and to sometimes step back one step and keep, as a scientist, a certain critical distance and contextualize the ecosystem services approach into other policy fields. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Kurt.